All right. That was up there is not the Neuse. The image that you had included is the Neuse 2. Of the Ironclad in the museum. Two sites because we're only about a block away from each other.
I'm sorry I confused them.
No, that's fine. It happens. So, CSS Neuse. Show of hands, how many people have been to the museum before? Oh, good. All right, so about half of you. Perfect. For the other of you, why haven't you been? You really need to get up there about an hour and a half from here. We're open Tuesday to Saturday, 9 to 5. And as I like to say, one of the reasons that Civil War fans or Civil War buffs should visit is it's the only place in the world you can see what we have. And that is a commissioned Confederate ironclad above water. Every other commissioned Confederate ironclad is below the water. So unless you're a certified scuba diver and you can get through several feet of mud, this is probably your best chance to see. Okay. So when the war begins in 1861, the South realizes very quickly that they have about, well, several thousand miles of coastline to defend and no real navy to do it with. When the war begins, the Union has about 70 total ships in the Navy. Of those, about 30 are on foreign duty, about 20 on domestic duty, and 20 aren't even ready. They're laid up. And of course, the South starts with no Navy. You have small state navies that started. Carolina had a state Navy, Georgia had a state Navy, Virginia had a state Navy. But these were very small ships for the most part, very quite ineffective. And what you find is that there are a number of qualified officers who resigned from the United States Navy, much as the Army officers had resigned from the U.S. Army to go south. The problem was when they came south, there was no ships ready for them. And by the next year, by 1862, most of you probably know that there were several incursions by federal troops into North Carolina. Roanoke Island was taken. The Outer Banks were captured. Morehead City, Beaufort, and all the way up to New Bern was captured in March of 1862. And this entire time, the government in Raleigh is screaming at Richmond, "You've taken all our troops, or almost all of them, and they're fighting in Virginia. What are you doing to protect North Carolina?" And Richmond didn't have much of an answer. And it was right for the authorities in Raleigh because even though there was a rail line, major rail line, leading out of Morehead City all the way through to the interior, the real highways in 1861 into the interior of the state are the rivers. If you controlled the rivers, you could control access deep into the state. As a result, by the fall of 1862, the Confederate Navy decides to start to try to build ironclads for defense in the North Carolina River system. Now, when I talk about Eastern North Carolina, Wilmington is not part of my discussion. Wilmington is its own animal. The North Carolina was built here. The Raleigh was built here. They had the Wilmington was on the stocks when the city fell. So there were 3 ironclads that were being constructed in Wilmington. The other 3 in North Carolina were constructed by Roanoke, the Tar, and the Neuse. Those were the 3 rivers that they really wanted to defend. Albemarle was the ship that was constructed on, of course, more famous, a lot more famous than the Neuse, but they were sister ships built off the same set of plans. They tried to build a ship, we affectionately call it the Tar, but it was destroyed on the stocks in a cavalry raid by the Union in the summer of 1863. So it never got anywhere, it was destroyed. And of course, there was the Neuse on. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. So where did this idea of ironclads originate? Basically, it goes back to the Crimean War, back into the early 1850s, when it was France and Britain fighting Russia in the Crimea. And for those of you who know anything about geopolitics in Europe, they're still fighting over the Crimea. What basically happens is the French build a floating battery. They park it off the coast of Sevastopol, and they iron plate or armor plate the side that is facing the Russian city. And so the Russians can fire their cannons out of the fort at Sevastopol. It hits the side, bounces off, doesn't do any damage. The French can fire back, and they're doing real damage. And that grew into the concept of an ironclad. What if you took this floating armored battery idea, you put a couple steam engines in it, and it can move? That's where the idea of an ironclad comes from in the 1850s. And it just so happened that the senator who was the chairman of the Senate Committee on the Navy, basically, was from Florida. He was a gentleman by the name of Stephen Mallory. When the South leaves, forms the Confederacy, Mallory, of course, resigns, goes south. He becomes the Secretary of the Navy. It was said that Jefferson Davis trusted him implicitly when it came to naval policy, naval design, naval implementation. And it should say something, too, that he's one of the only two cabinet secretaries Davis never replaced. From the very beginning of the war to the very end, it was always Mallory at the Navy Department. Okay, next. So in October 1862, they decide to try to start building this ironclad in the town of Whitehall, which, as the crow flies, is about 15 miles upriver from Kinston towards Goldsboro. Today, the town is not called Whitehall. It is called Seven Springs. It's a very tiny town. Today, there may be 150 people that live in this town. It's very small, on the Neuse River. They acquire local timber. The construction firm that wins the design or wins the contract to build it is out of New Bern. Can you see why this might be a problem? New Bern is under federal occupation, and the shipbuilding firm that wins it had never built a military warship before. They were building civilian boats, civilian ships in New Bern. And now they found themselves, of course, probably 40 miles outside of New Bern on the Neuse River, constructing the ship from scratch. The ship was made almost entirely out of longleaf pine, North Carolina longleaf pine. One of the issues, though, that they ran into very quickly is that almost all the wood they were using was green timber. I heard somebody say, uh-oh. Yes, uh-oh, bad news. Why? So no one was prepared for this war, especially when it comes to the naval part of it. They didn't have hundreds of thousands of boards sitting there drying out for years and years in order to start building ships. They basically had to cut down a tree, saw the timber, and start installing it. That's bad, because the wood still has a tremendous amount of water in it. And as the water evaporates, the wood warps, it splits, it cracks. That's bad news on a warship, bad news on a wooden-hulled ship. And that's the problem that almost every Confederate ironclad faced was green wood, including the ships built here in Wilmington. Okay, next slide. So they started building this ship in October. 2 months later, in December of 1862, General John G. Foster leads a raid of between 12,000 to 14,000 Federal soldiers out of New Bern, and their goal is to attack and destroy the railroad bridge in Goldsboro. Goldsboro is the key rail junction in eastern North Carolina. It's where the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad goes north-south, and it crosses over the North Carolina and Atlantic Railroad. So Goldsboro is the key rail junction, and the Federals knew that. And Foster begins his move to the west. At the same time, Burnside is moving his army south towards Fredericksburg. There's no direct evidence, I haven't found any, that said it was a coordinated assault, but the timing is very interesting. Foster is moving to cut this rail line and cut off Lee's supply line from North Carolina. At the same time, Burnside is moving south on Lee's army directly. They fight at the first Battle of First Kinston. The Confederate command there is commanded by General Nathan Shanks Evans, a South Carolinian. Evans was probably more famous at this point of the war for commanding his small South Carolina brigade at Manassas, at the First Battle of Manassas, at the Stone Bridge. And Evans was severely outnumbered. He was outnumbered almost probably close to 4-1. And in the kind of the confusion to get back across the river back into Kinston, he thought he had all his men, but one of his regiments didn't get the message in time. And he lights the bridge on fire, trying to, and so an entire South Carolina regiment ends up being captured. The Federals put the fire out fairly quickly. They cross into Kinston. Evans asks for a parley. It's granted. He pulls his men out and leaves. The Federals occupy Kinston basically overnight, and the next morning they move back onto the south side of the river and they head for Goldsboro. Well, between Goldsboro and Kinston, they were building the CSS Neuse. It was basically not even a rough wooden shell by that point. They were only about 2 months into the construction. And they were building the Neuse on the north bank of the river. Foster's men are on the south bank. So as they're coming into Whitehall, they know that there's something there. They do a little reconnaissance. They see this thing being built on the other side of the river. They bring in artillery. They try to shell it. And there's a story, an account of one soldier who was trying to swim across the Neuse to get close enough to light it on fire. It's December. The water's probably not very conducive to swimming. Basically, the story goes that he was in the river, he took a lot of Confederate fire and decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and he retreated back to the bank that they were firing from. They tried to take the Neuse out, but they couldn't do it. And the bridges in Seven Springs, now Seven Springs, had been destroyed. So the Federals were basically forced to just continue their march to Goldsboro. They got to Goldsboro, they fought another battle. Again, it was like 2 Confederate regiments that were severely outnumbered, and they were mauled. The Federals burned the bridge. They marched back to New Bern. The Confederates rebuilt it in 6 weeks. And rail service returns, Wilmington to Weldon Railroad. So, next, please. And along with that, construction on the Neuse resumes. By February of 1863, they're building on her again. She puts into the Neuse River in the summer of 1863 like a rough wooden shell. And they know that they're going to have to do a lot more work to it, but because of kind of the remoteness of the location where she's being constructed, there are no rail lines that are close. They can't get a lot of that heavy machinery that they need. They can't get the iron they need. They can't move the guns that they need. They decide to move her down the river to Kinston. They build a coffer dam about 300 yards from where the museum currently sits in the Neuse River. They have a small gauge, basically railroad line that they run down the street that comes off of the main railroad terminal in Kinston, and they outfit her for war. The bottom deck, they install the steam machinery, the engines, the boilers, the firebox, the coal. Then they build the deck up, and then they add the guns, and then they build the casemate on top and put 2 layers of 2-inch iron armored plate all over the vertical surfaces of the ship. On the flat surfaces, there is no armor plating. So on her forward decking, no plate. They kind of wanted, they didn't want to make it any heavier than it had to be. Especially as the Neuse River was very, and still is, subject to rise and fall quite rapidly as far as river level goes. 152 feet long, 34 feet wide. She drew, as you can see in the image here, she was a flat-bottomed boat, flat-bottomed ship, no angled keel. She was designed to be used in the rivers and the sounds of North Carolina. She was not made for open ocean. She would have probably floundered had she gone out, maybe even into the Pamlico Sound. Didn't even get that far. She's armed with two 6.4-inch Brook rifles, probably the best naval rifle of the war, Brooks, and powered by two screw engines that were both mounted on her starboard side. For those of you landlubbers, that's the right side of the ship. Okay. All right, next. 1864, she is finished. She is ready to fight. Her sister ship, the Albemarle, up on the Roanoke, is also ready to fight. But there's a problem. The crew. They don't have many. The Army has monopolized everything. And that's a direct quote from one of the naval officers' letters. Quote, "The Army monopolizes everything. The rails, the manpower, everything is controlled and run by the Confederate Army. So the Navy has to beg for anything it can get." The Navy has a bunch of ironclads that are about to come online in 1864 in several areas of the South. What they lack are crew. And Davis has a meeting with Secretary Mallory, and Mallory basically, this is the first week of January of 1864. Mallory says, "Mr. President, I need men. I don't really care where they come from. They don't even have to be qualified sailors, but I need men." Davis understands. The next day, he has a meeting with General Lee. And Lee and him come to an agreement, and he says, "I need X number of men from your Army to transfer to the Navy so we can have gunboats, so we can have ships that serve." Okay. Lee goes back, tells his brigadiers, "I need 13 men from your command. I need 12 from yours. I need 18 from yours." Put yourself in the position of a brigade commander in Lee's army. You're already at half strength. Winter has taken its toll. Desertion is a problem. And now you want me to take 15, 20 men out of my command and send them to the Navy? Who am I going to send? The best and the brightest? No. There are two kinds that get sent. One, expected, the shirkers, the deserters, the men who've been convicted of being absent without leave or desertion. Those guys are transferred to the Navy. Troublemakers. The second kind of folks that go, men that are transferred, are those who have been combat wounded. Once, sometimes twice. In one occasion, I saw 3 times. But they're wounded so as they cannot physically keep up with an army on campaign. Wounded in the knee, wounded in the ankle, wounded in the head. They can still serve, but they can't march 20 miles a day. They're just physically incapable of it because of their wounds. They get transferred to the Navy. I always thought it would be an interesting dynamic. I would love to have been a fly on the wall to see those two types of men intermix. Guys who've been wounded in combat multiple times with guys who've never even seen the elephant because they were always in the rear when stuff was going on up front on purpose. Interesting dynamic. So she is commissioned April 19th, 1864, gets into the river. She has orders to go down with a combined Army-Navy assault. They're going to try to take New Bern again. This would have been the third attempt. And the Neuse gets a little below the city, and she hits a sandbar, and she grounds. She grounds hard aground. cannot get her off. They try lightening the load, they try throwing stuff overboard, they try getting the big pole out and pushing off. No good. So she is stranded. They call off the assault. The Army's not going by itself. And she remained stranded on the sandbar for almost a month until rain upstate flooded the river. She rose on her own. By that time, it's too late. She goes back and sits in Kinston. Scuttlebutt among the crew was that this was done on purpose. Why? The pilot was from Newbern. And the thought was that he didn't want a warship to go down and shell his own hometown. So he ran it aground on purpose. Is there any truth to that? Probably not. Was the pilot from Newbern? Yes, he was. Who knows? It's a good story. Okay, next. My master's thesis was on the crew of the ship. So I know a lot more about these guys than any person really should. The gentleman up in the top left is Lieutenant William Sharp. Sharp is the first commander of the vessel when it's being constructed. He's on site. He's in Kinston. He's an old line Navy officer, former U.S. Navy officer. He ends up being transferred out. They bring Lieutenant Loyal in. Loyal is her skipper when she's commissioned. But Loyal is also, like Sharp, is a Virginian, and he wants to go back to Virginia. And so, is the guy in the center, North Carolina native Joseph Price. Price is actually buried here in Wilmington. Price is a Wilmington native. And Price did not serve in the pre-war Navy. Price served in the Revenue Cutter Service, which today we would probably call the Coast Guard. Yeah. He was serving in the Revenue Cutter Service when the war started in California. So when news finally reaches that there's a war, he resigns his commission and makes his way overland, California through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, all the way back to North Carolina. By the time that happens, it took him like 4.5, 5 months to do it. He and his father join a Confederate artillery unit. He's an Army officer for about a year until things in the Navy start happening. He resigns, he joins the Navy. He's committed the Neuse as a reward because he was the highest, basically the highest ranking officer to survive what the Navy calls a cutting out expedition. They went to capture a Union ship in Savannah or off the coast of Savannah called the Water Witch. And he was the senior surviving officer basically from the capture and of the Water Witch. And as a reward, he's given command to the Neuse. Gentleman at the top right, that is Lieutenant Hogue. Hogue served as the executive officer on board the ship. Hogue was a Virginian, but today he would have been a West Virginian. He's from the county, if you've ever seen like an image of West Virginia, there's a little lip that goes up next to Pennsylvania. He was from that county that borders Pennsylvania on one side and Ohio on the other. Hogue is wounded twice during the war, promoted twice for gallantry. He is on the expedition to capture the USS Underwriter in Newbern. Underwriter's fantastic story. Basically, they take this Union ship under the cover of darkness. They want to capture it, but a Union shell carries away the walking beam engine on the deck, and the boilers are cold. So they know it was going to be 45 minutes before they could get anywhere. And besides that, the shell destroyed the engine. So the commander of the expedition, John Taylor Wood, who was Jefferson Davis's nephew by his first wife, orders the ship to be destroyed. They pack gunpowder, they light the fuse, they get off, they're rowing away, they've got a bunch of prisoners. 5 minutes goes by, 10 minutes goes by, 15 minutes goes by, nothing happens. Taylor Wood looks at Hogue and says, Lieutenant Hogue, go back on board and find out why it's not blowing up. Yes, sir. He does. He finds out that the main fire that had led to the gunpowder went out. So he had to relight it and get the hell off the ship. He did, and within about 7 or 8 minutes, the whole thing went up. Huge explosion, sank in New Bern Harbor. Its remains are still there. And again, for his service, for his gallantry, he's made executive officer on board the Neuse. He was an 1859 graduate of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. In the bottom row, the gentleman on the left there, that is Lieutenant Pilote. Pilote was one of the gunnery officers on board the Neuse. He would have graduated from the Naval Academy in 1861, but he was a South Carolinian. So he resigned his commission in December of 1860. He was going to graduate in June or June of 61. He fights on the CSS Arkansas. He is assigned to the Chicora or the Palmetto State. I can never remember which one. But then he is assigned as one of the gunnery officers on board Neuse. The other two gentlemen there on the bottom right is doctor. One is the physician, and the other a doctor, not doctor, a gunnery, but not an officer. He was an enlisted gunneryman. Now, second one here on the bottom, you see the captain's bars on his collar. That man is John Frank Wheelis. John Frank Wheelis was from Nashville, Tennessee. He was orphaned at a young age. He was raised by his older brother. His older brother was a banker in Nashville. John became a teller at 16 and was vice president of the bank by 18. He was, by all accounts, a very gifted man when it came to finances. He basically at 20, I think he was 21 or 22, was forming his own bank, and the war started. He drops it all. He volunteers for service. He's elected as the first lieutenant for Company C of the 1st Tennessee Infantry. Why 1st Tennessee Infantry? You probably know it. If you've ever read Sam Watkins, he writes about Company H of the 1st Tennessee. Same regiment, just a different company. Starts with the first year of the war, serves through Shiloh, is promoted to captaincy. He commands the company, and he fights at Perryville. He is so severely wounded at Perryville, he's left on the field as the Confederate Army retreats. He's taken prisoner by the Union, sent to a hospital, recovers, and remember, this is before the whole POW thing. They're still exchanging prisoners. So he's exchanged. He goes back south. The problem was, Company C, the 1st Tennessee, had already elected another captain. They already had another commander. They didn't need him anymore. So he became what we call a superfluous officer, an officer without a command. So he's assigned to the staff of General Leonidas Polk. He's assigned to the staff of General Braxton Bragg. And he eventually is put in command of a small army garrison in Rome, Georgia. But by late 1863, he realizes that because of his wounds, he cannot keep pace with an army on campaign, much as some of the men who were transferred to the Navy. So using his banking connections, he's able to get a commission in the Confederate Navy. He resigns his Army commission and becomes an assistant paymaster for the Navy. His very first duty station, Kinston, North Carolina, as the assistant paymaster on the CSS Neuse. He stays on the Neuse for several months. He's eventually transferred to Richmond. He is the paymaster who accompanies the Confederate Treasury out of Richmond as it falls in 1865. He ends up going with the Treasury, which some of it was Confederate Treasury money, but a lot of it was actually individual Richmond bank money they were trying to get out of town. It's a fascinating story for Wheels. I'm actually going to be in Nashville next week, and I'm going to visit his grave. He's buried in Nashville. So, again, I know more about these guys than I need to. Okay, next slide, please. So, this brings us back to the Neuse. She is in Kinston. It is March of 1865. The situation in the state has drastically changed within the last year. Wilmington has fallen. Sherman is coming up through the South from South Carolina, and left a wake of destruction behind him. And there's a large, now very large federal force that have landed at New Bern. And the goal with the group at New Bern and Sherman's army, they want to meet at Goldsboro. Goldsboro is the key. On the way, Sherman's army, of course, runs into Confederate forces at Averysboro. And as the federal forces are moving west out of New Bern towards Kinston, they encounter what is left of the Army of Tennessee. A corps is now the size of a division is now the size of a brigade is now the size of a regiment. I mean, it's severely reduced after their combats at Franklin and Nashville. And the Neuse is given a direct order by General Braxton Bragg. Engage the enemy, delay them as much as possible, return to Kinston, scuttle your ship. That was the order. We have the diary of a gunner, Eugene Brown, and we have one of his letters says, quote, "We shelled the enemy vigorously for 40 minutes. That booming was her funeral knell," talking about the ship, meaning that was the end. This was her final parting before she was to be destroyed. They take the ship back to Kinston. Okay, I'm sorry, next slide. They take the ship back to Kinston. They beach it directly across from where it had run aground 11 months before, and they move to scuttle the ship. The first thing they do is they take a hatchet and they break up the ship's wheel. So even if somehow it's recovered, there's no way to steer it. Makes sense. Then they start setting small fires throughout the ship, the base, and they take a large amount of gunpowder. They put it at the port bow. Port, it's the left side. Again, landlubbers, the left side, port side. And they light the fires. They abandon ship. There's an explosion. Water rushes in, puts out a lot of those fires they had lit, and she sinks. But while she's on fire, again, another letter entry from Eugene Brown. His quote is, "How greedily the flames of fire licked her noble sides. How splendidly was she devoured." She sank right there, close to the riverbank in March of 1865. No casualties. Everybody got off. And at that point, some of the officers and men were ordered to Halifax. And they were told to go to Halifax to await further orders. Some of them just kind of melted away. The war is coming to a close. A lot of them can see it. It's not going to be going on much longer. So, all right, next slide. It's over, which is only a couple months later, May of 1865. The Confederate government collapses. It's gone. The Union says all former property and debts that the Confederate government owed now belong to the United States. As property, the remains of the Neuse, therefore, now belong to the federal government. They put out a salvage contract in the winter of 1865. It was awarded to a firm called Satterley and Lyon, which was out of New York City. Satterley and Lyon, I would love to be able to find their archives, if it even exists, because Neuse was one of 4 ironclads that they got the contract to recover. Would love to see that. But I don't know that it exists anymore. Anyway, they put an ad in the New Bern paper. They say, look, we need workers, and we are going to be selling salvage. December of 1865, January of 1866, they build a cofferdam around the remains, or as much as they can. They take out the engines, the boilers, the machinery. They resell the engines to a sawmill. They were sawmill engines to begin with. They sell them to a different sawmill. Anchors, anchor chain, propellers, anything they could, any of value, especially iron, which was a very valuable commodity in the Reconstruction South, they sell. There's a handful of things they don't get. They don't mess with the shells. They do take the guns, but the guns are retained by the Navy. Everything else goes to Satterlee and Lyon. Try to sell at a profit. And then they just kind of let her go. They abandon her. She just sinks back into the river. This is an image of her sister, Albemarle. Albemarle is a picture of the yard. All her iron plating on the outside has been removed, but that gives you an idea for how the ship would have looked after the iron plating was stripped off of it. Okay, next, please. So she sits underwater for 100 years, from 1865, 1866, until the early 1960s, with the centennial of the war. It was basically asked in Kinston, well, what did Kinston do during the war? Well, Kinston built an ironclad. Really? Where is it? Out there somewhere. And these three businessmen get together and they think, this is a money-making opportunity. If we can raise this thing, somebody's going to pay us a lot of money for it. So they get together and they try to raise it. It is not by any means an archaeological recovery. They destroy half the ship getting it up. There was an entire forward deck from the casemate to the bow, ripped up, gone. Doorways, hallways, passageways on the interior, gone, ripped up, tossed aside. They were trying to lighten the load because they wanted to raise the hull. They didn't care about archaeology. They didn't care about history or preservation. And it would never happen today. The late, great Ed Bars, once I heard him say, if you want to see how to recover an ironclad right, go see the Cairo. If you want to see how to recover an ironclad wrong, go see the Neuse. And that's exactly the truth. I hate to say it, but that's exactly the truth. Here you can see the Marines from Jacksonville, from Camp Lejeune, and they're taking out live 6.4-inch explosive shells to demill them. Yeah. And there were dozens of shells of several different types found on board. Okay, next, please. So when they're recovering her in the 1960s, the three businessmen who got together said, this wreck is ours. Well, the landowner adjacent to it said, no, it's on my property, it's mine. And they bickered, and they argued, and they bitched back and forth about who should have the rights to this thing. The state of North Carolina finally steps in and says, here is some money, here is some money, it belongs to the state. The Neuse is the reason why a state law was passed, I think one General Assembly session later, that said if anything is underwater more than 10 years, it automatically belongs to the state. True story, because of the Neuse. Right? Now, they recover her, they set her aside on the riverbank, and she immediately starts deteriorating because she had been in the mud. She'd been protected from deterioration. But now that she was on the surface, not protected by the mud, being oxygenated, she starts to deteriorate. Pieces are falling off. People are looting it, carrying things away that are just tossed up on the shore. The state now owns it. The state says, we've got to do something with this. Okay, well, what do you want to do? Let's move it to a state historic site. Haha, great. Where's the closest one? It's 3 miles down the road. Well, what is it? It's the grave of the first governor of North Carolina. Perfect. Totally different time period, totally different subject matter, but that's where they moved it because that was the closest place. However, they couldn't move it in one piece. The thing was too damn big and too damn heavy. So they chainsawed it into 3 pieces. A bow, a center, and a stern. They moved it 3 road miles, weighs 105 tons, and they put it at the Caswell site. Eventually, they built its own shelter, and it was concrete and steel, very well protected, and they opened it up for tours. People could come and see it. At one time, people could go and walk on it. Can't do that anymore. They would have activities and demonstrations. This is the former site manager, a couple before me, Eugene Brown, who just passed away in December. He was a veteran as well. Excellent. I learned a lot from him. Just sit down and having conversations with him. He was a site manager for almost 30 years. So he knew a thing or two about the gunboat. Okay. And then here in North Carolina, you get this thing called hurricanes, especially F-named hurricanes, Fran and Floyd. And then later you guys got Florence too. So Fran, on the left there, flooded the site, and you can see the gunboat underneath the concrete shelter, and big trees down on the property. After that, it was decided, okay, maybe, even though this is a 100-year flood, maybe this thing is a little too close to the river. Let's try to move it. So the next year, they moved it from its location up closer to the street, up on what is called. They built another temporary shelter, put it under there. Perfect, great. We're not going to get another, this is a 100-year flood. That's not going to happen again. Well, the next year, Floyd. And Floyd would have, had the boat remained, would have destroyed it. It would have carried it down. They got 7 more feet of water than was in this picture on the left. 7 more feet. Flooded the visitor center, destroyed a lot of things in the visitor center, would have carried the ship downriver. Who knows what would have happened to it. But it was saved because it was moved. In its new home, it was still subject, even though it was covered under a big, what I call a big carport, it was still subject to environmental distress. I don't know if you know this about North Carolina. It gets kind of hot and humid in the summer, and in the wintertime, it can get really cold and dry. And that constant change makes the wood expand and contract, and expand and contract. And my previous operations manager used to tell me, yeah, we'd come in and there'd be pieces of the ship on the ground, just falling off. And so they knew that they had to find a better home for it, had to find something that was permanent, indoor, climate controlled. And they started looking in downtown Kinston to make this kind of its own separate site, removed from the Governor Council. Next, please. And they found this building on the corner of Queen and Capitol Street. They start construction. About $3.5 million worth of state funds go into it, and almost the same amount of private funding goes into this building to help get it into a position where it can house the ship. Very fortunate. Over 12,000 objects are recovered off the remains of the ship. They don't really care about archaeology, but they did some. So we're very fortunate for that. All right, next one. And what you get is the remains of the ship inside the museum. Over the top of it, you can see we have a ghosting structure, or an outline structure. Shows you how big the ship would have been if it was in there and complete. All the wood that we have exists below the waterline. You kind of have to use your imagination to see what's above it. 5 gun ports in the back. 2 guns, but they're on a shifting pivot carriage, meaning once they fire and recoil, you can put a big pivot pin in the carriage and rotate it and run it out of gun port. So 2 guns, but 10 gun ports to fire at. And we now have the CSS Neuse Museum in downtown Kinston. The ship is obviously the centerpiece. It's a 2-floor museum. The bottom floor is all about the Navy. And the mezzanine level, we talk about Army campaigns in Eastern North Carolina. We talk about civilian life during the Civil War also. Next slide, please. CSS Neuse Museum, North Queen Street. You can find us on Facebook. please look up CSS Neuse. That's my direct line and my direct email if you want to contact me. And that, folks, that's the CSS Neuse. Any questions? Yes, sir.
When Fran and Floyd came through, was the ship at the Caswell location?
Yeah. It was moved there in the mid-1960s. And so it's been there for 65, 75, 80, about 25, 30 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. Yeah. Yes, sir.
And even though it's inside now, well protected, is there still any degradation slowly taking place, or is it in good shape?
It is in remarkably good shape. We have had almost little to nothing fall off the ship or break off the ship. We try to keep it in the summertime. It's a little harder to keep it temperature controlled because we have, unfortunately, a metal roof. I don't know who designed that. Wasn't me. So we keep the temperature between like 68 and 78, and the humidity roughly 30 to 40%, and it seems to do really, really well inside. Again, only remaining commissioned Confederate ironclad above water. You can see the Jackson at the Navy, Georgia, never commissioned. Okay. You can see parts of the Georgia when it's done being conserved. It's only parts of it, not the whole ship. Okay. Hunley, not a Confederate naval vessel. The Hunley was an Army boat, skippered by an Army lieutenant. Volunteer crew, most of them Navy, but the Hunley was an Army project, not a Navy boat. That's why it's not the CSS Hunley. It's the HL Hunley. Yep. You learn something new today. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Albemarle's activities?
Yeah, Albemarle operated on almost kind of the same building schedule that Neuse had. It was October of 62, November 62. Its chief designer, chief builder was a gentleman, Gilbert Elliott. Elliott was 19 years old, and he's building the ship almost entirely in a cornfield in Scotland Neck, North Carolina. She puts in just like Neuse does, but Elliott, as he's building her, thinks that quarter panel gun ports are folly. He thinks it weakens the structure of the casemate, so he just doesn't put them in. So Albemarle, the biggest difference between Albemarle and Neuse is Neuse has 10 gun ports, Albemarle only has 6. There's no quarter panel gun ports on the bow and the stern. She fights the Battle of Plymouth, basically single-handedly drives Federal troops off. Confederates able to come in and occupy Plymouth, North Carolina. She is a scourge on the River. The Union Navy has really nothing that can stop her. And it's only because of the actions of a young U.S. naval officer leading a commando raid. That's Lieutenant Cushing. Leads a commando raid, sticks to the spar torpedo below the waterline where Confederate ironclads are vulnerable. It's the only place you can hit them. And she sinks dockside in Plymouth. Elliott had a lot of motivation to do it. His brother had been killed at Gettysburg. His brother was Alonzo Cushing, artillery commander at Pickett's Charge. And his mentor was Charles Flusser, was captain of the Southfield. And when the first time the Albemarle came in to fight, faced the Southfield and the Miami, they were so close that Flusser says to his artillery, his commander, his gun captain, fire at that vessel. And sir, she's too close. Fire at that damn vessel. He moves him aside, pulls the lanyard himself. Ball hits him. Just a little bit in too much, but I mean, he wanted to stop her. He thought that he had to, but yeah, he lost his head. I mean, literally. But yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that both engines were on the same side of the boat.
Yes, sir. They were both on the starboard side.
Why would they do that? Isn't it hard to balance?
It was just the way, well, the engines were on the starboard side, but the coal was on the port side. So they kind of balanced out in weight. I'm not a naval engineer. I'm not a naval architect. I'm a historian. So I really don't know why they did that, but that was the design that John L. Porter came up with. And Porter was the chief naval architect for the Confederacy. He designed I think he designed every Confederate ironclad that was eventually commissioned.
How many screws?
Two. Twin screws. Yeah, it's very funky kind of how it was set up. So does anyone know how many ironclads were built and commissioned in the South in 4 years of war? 26. For a largely agrarian country with very little centralized or heavy industry, our government can't get a website to work in 4 years. I mean, so it's amazing what they could do with the little that they had. Yes, sir.
How did the lame and lazy crew shape up?
It was mixed story, mixed bag. Several of them that I tracked down list their 1860 profession as in the census as mariner or sailor. Many of them, though, were just farmers or they were farm laborers. They come in, they're assigned to gun crews. They're, given very basic tasks, but almost none of these men had ever been on a ship before and had no idea what to expect. There's an interesting story. Private Pittman, who became a sailor Pittman, when he enlisted in a Virginia regiment in 1861, he listed his profession as sailor. Hometown, any guesses? New York, New York, fighting in the Confederate infantry. And he wasn't the only one. Neuse had the assistant surgeon was from New York. He was a dentist living in New Bern. There was a crewman from Philadelphia. There was a crewman from Delaware. Most of the crew are from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. But remember I told you about Wheelus. Wheelus is Tennessee. There was one from Texas. There was two from Georgia, maybe one from Alabama too. So it really was kind of across the South. Most of them, though, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, kind of concentrated. They didn't have any huge disciplinary problems. There were issues, but nothing big. No revolts or mutinies or anything else like that. The officers were professionals, and they tried to instill discipline in the men. I think you have the added advantage, though, of about at least a third of the crew had served in the Army before they came to the Navy. So, yes, sir.
First off, Matt, thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that it was commissioned out of a company out of New Bern, I think you said, the Neuse?
Oh, yeah, the constructors. Yeah.
So do you have any record of how much they actually paid?
Yeah. The Neuse was over budget by almost double. I think the original estimate, the original contract awarded was for something around the neighborhood of $800,000. And her final tally was about 1.4 million to construct.
Did they ever get that money?
Confederate script, yeah. It's I don't know. I don't know the specifics of the financials. I just know the numbers. Yeah. That'd be a good research project for somebody. That was a lot of money. Yep. A lot of money. Hey, yes, sir. I want to say it was almost rivers and different objectives. The objective to recover the Cairo was to recover the first Union ironclad, or the first ship ever sunk by a mine. Cairo had the unfortunate distinction of striking a Confederate torpedo and overturning and sinking in the Mississippi. It's the first ship ever sunk by a mine. They said, let's go get that thing. Let's restore, let's preserve it. The emphasis for this was, let's go make money. Yes, sir. Yes. We have on display 3 pieces of plate. And I think they're the only 3 that we have. So it's like they could have missed it. It could have fallen in the river and they couldn't get to it. But we have all 3 pieces on display. Unlike some other museums where you're not allowed to touch anything, you can touch all 3 pieces of iron plate. We also have the original ship's bell, which is really cool. That's like the heart, the beating heart of the ship. We're very fortunate to have that. We have interior door locks, locks, hinges. We have original rope, original block and tackle, original ladder, original oar locks. It's amazing. And of course, spike, 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 nail, 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 nail. It's amazing what we do have from the ship that's there to tell a story. For example, there was a debate for a while on 2 things. One, what did the enlisted sailors, where did they sleep? How did they sleep? What did they have to sleep in? Well, we found hammock hooks and hammock rings in the remains. So we know the enlisted men had hammocks. And we know the officers had bunk beds because we have receipts in the Confederate archives for purchase of bunk beds. We know those went to the officers. Okay. There was another debate that was only solved a few years ago. It was, okay, so the interior of these ships was whitewashed for obvious reasons. There's no electricity. There is very little sunlight that's going to get through the armor and the plating, and the way the ship is designed not to let a lot of light in. So they wanted to be able to reflect the maximum amount of light that they could. But the question was, okay, did they install everything and then whitewash it once it was in? Or did they whitewash the boards first and then install them? How the hell are you going to solve that question, right? We did. Why? Because a family who had helped with the preservation back in the 60s came and donated 3 interior pieces of wood that were tongue and groove. The interior of the gun, the casemate. And when you look inside the grooves, it's whitewashed. So we know it was done first and then installed, and not done once it was in place. It's fun how you can solve little mysteries like that. Right, Becky? You have a question?
Has anybody gone back to the original site to see if there's anything left there?
There is. So when
And we know that,
When Satterley and Lyon came, one of the things they did was they cut out a piece of the casemate and they just tossed it in the river. It's still in the river. People have seen it when the water is really, really low. It's actually down close to the bridge that you take over from 70, like close to King's Barbecue. It's on that side. It's probably within 200 feet of the bridge. When the river's really low, you can see the corner of it sticking up. So it's there. And I imagine that if you were able to get like a naval magnetometer out, you'd probably hit all sorts of crap right in that curve. Well, no, not directly because, well, you know how department politics are. So I would love to see it. We were actually going to have underwater archaeology come and do a scan of the river to see if they could actually locate that piece. They were scheduled 3 times, and 3 times they had to bail, all for different reasons. One time the river was too high, one time the river was too low, and one time their trailer broke. So, but I know you know underwater archaeology people. I can probably get them if they need something to do for a couple days. Come on to Kinston. Prowl around in the Neuse River and see what you can find. So, anybody else? Yes.
the museum does a lot of community programs.
Yes.
Let us know what's coming up this summer that we may be a part of.
Sure. We've got a program coming up with Emily Liposardi. She's doing a dinner theater program. You may know Emily. She has done Rose O'Neill Greenhow impression. She's doing a different impression. I don't remember the name of the lady that she's doing, but that's going to be in June. We've got a summer living history program on July 11th. It's called Sailors in the Summer. Basically, we have about 35 reenactors, living historians come and bring the museum to life. They're doing mostly naval impressions, but some Army impressions as well. And that's all day. I think it's like 10 to 4 on the 11th. And then we do homeschool programs every month. when school is in session. We do around 10,000 visitors a year. And we are one of the very few historic sites that charge admission. A lot of sites don't charge admission. Some sites are now coming to charge admission because of what's been going on with building. But our admission price is the same as it was 12 years ago, which is $5 for adults, $4 for seniors or active duty military, and $2 for students. So, yep, I think it's well worth it to see what we got. Mr. Murray.
You know what happened to the engines before? I know there was a rumor that somebody had a boiler that turned out to be.
So the engines were sold to a different sawmill in Kinston. The boilers were sold also to a mill, and they exploded about 12 years later in the 1870s. There's a newspaper article that talks about the explosion of the boilers off the Ram Neuse. So there was a theory out there that, oh no, this is the boiler off the Neuse because my granddaddy said that his granddaddy bought it and he said it was from the Neuse. It very well could have been from a ship named the Neuse. There was the Ironclad Neuse. There was also at least 3 other ships that patrolled up and down the Neuse River in the following years as steamboats, basically moving people and goods up and down the Neuse River, named Neuse, that were steam powered. And that's probably where that boiler came from. It probably is a boiler off the Neuse, just not ours. So, yeah, true story. Anybody else?
Where were the guns from?
6.4-inch Brooks, manufactured under the design specification by John Mercer Brooke. They were probably made in the Selma Arsenal, in Selma, Alabama, and brought up via the rails. Interesting story, kind of a side note. There were only 2 places in the Confederacy that could make rolled iron plate for use on Confederate ironclads. Tredegar in Richmond and a rolling mill in Atlanta. That was it. Those are the 2 places you could do it. Almost all the iron rolled by Tredegar stayed in Virginia. It went on the Virginia II. It went on the Fredericksburg. It went on all the ships in the James River Squadron. So we're pretty sure that the iron off the Neuse came from Atlanta. But it wasn't the first shipment. First shipment, in order to get to Kinston from Atlanta, you had to go through Augusta into South Carolina, change rail because the gauge was different, then go to the North Carolina line, then change again because the gauge was different, and then to get to Kinston. And the first time that the iron came through to equip Albemarle and Neuse, it was intercepted by South Carolina state authorities who claimed that possession is 9/10 the law, and they took the iron plate and they sent it to Charleston to outfit the Chicora and the Palmetto State. So it had to be the second shipment of iron. And one of the officers, who was Lieutenant Minor, who was kind of helping to oversee the speedily construction of the Neuse, said basically we're wanting for iron because South Carolina stole it and we need to get more. A lot of the manpower used to finish the ship was Army contracted. The Navy contracted Army soldiers who were in garrison duty in Kinston to finish building the ship. Many of them from the 18th Georgia Infantry. So, and being a native Georgian, I just think that's cool. Okay. All right, anybody else? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.